Hello and welcome to our program, Where God Weeps, a program in which we speak about the situation of the suffering and persecuted church around the world. The countdown to Christianity's disappearance in parts of the Middle East is ticking ever louder, and the clock can only be stopped if the international community acts now. This is the conclusion drawn by a new report titled Persecuted and Forgotten, a report on Christians oppressed for their faith, produced by the Catholic charity Aid to the Church in Need. Covering the period from July 2017 to July 2019, the report warns of Christianity vanishing from towns and cities in the region as, despite the defeat of ISIS, the impact of genocide has led to a dramatic decline in the numbers of faithful. The researchers note that although the international community has shown unprecedented concern about the persecution of this region's Christians, it has failed to provide the aid required to ensure its survival. It warns that the church in the region could vanish if radical Islamists were to mount another attack on vulnerable communities, a threat particularly evident in Iraq and Syria. To tell us more, it's my privilege to welcome one of the authors of this report, Mr. John Pontifex. But before we start talking, we're going to take a moment to watch a film which highlights the issues confronting the persecuted church today.
Christianity is the world's most persecuted religion, and yet many people have little idea of the scale of the crisis. For many years, the charity Aid to the Church in Need, ACN, has provided a voice for these voiceless Christians. Persecuted and Forgotten, a report on Christians oppressed for their faith, presents the findings of ACN's ongoing research, assessing recent patterns of hatred and discrimination. Covering the period from July 2017 to July 2019, this edition focuses on key developments in 12 countries where the suffering of Christians is particularly severe. In the Middle East, after the military defeat of ISIS in 2017, the scale of violence against Christians is much reduced. But evidence suggests that the retreating Islamists have left behind a legacy of increased hostility towards Christians stoked by militants operating underground. Genocide, extreme poverty, and Islamism have decimated Christian communities in Iraq and Syria. In some major towns and cities, the countdown to Christianity's disappearance is ticking ever louder. In parts of Africa, from Nigeria in the west to Madagascar in the east, Islamists are seeking to eliminate Christianity, using violence in some places and coercion in others. While Nigeria is the country where the most Christians are killed, Islamist fundamentalist attacks on Christians happen time and again, in Burkina Faso and in the Central African Republic. In other parts of Africa, like Sudan, Morocco, or Eritrea, the main threat to Christians comes from the state, with renewed acts of repression. Two of the most serious attacks against Christians carried out by Islamist militia in the reporting period took place in Sri Lanka and the Philippines, leaving hundreds of people wounded and killed. Indeed, the situation for Christians has deteriorated most in South and East Asia. In this region, a growing nationalism and state authoritarianism emerge as the main drivers of Christian persecution. Previously, North Korea, where Christians are routinely imprisoned in labor camps, was identified as the worst place in the world to be a Christian. The situation continues to be so bad that it can scarcely get any worse. In India, the principal threat to Christianity comes from Hindutva nationalism. More than 1,000 attacks on Christians have been reported, and more than 100 churches closed. Militants and state officials have stepped up a campaign of intimidation against Christians. Hindu extremist attacks increased also in neighboring Sri Lanka, where both Christians and Muslims were targeted. In China, for Christians and other minorities, the period under review saw a marked deterioration in human rights. Even though the Vatican signed a provisional agreement with China allowing the regime a say in episcopal appointments, the repression of the Catholic Church has markedly increased. In Pakistan, an alarming increase in incidents of violence against the faith groups has been recorded from both the state and non-state actors, many of them influenced by the Taliban in neighboring Afghanistan. Notwithstanding a massive breakthrough with the acquittal of Asia Bibi, a Christian woman on death row for alleged blasphemy, the government fails to tackle the growing climate of intolerance towards minorities. Initiatives by the international community in response to the persecution of Christians emerged as a major theme during the reporting period. In response to mounting concern that the West has largely ignored Christian persecution, the international community has shown unprecedented engagement with the topic over the past 2 years. Whatever good may come out of initiatives by the international community, however, will take time to materialize. Facing continued violent attacks, forced exodus, and possible extinction, Christians more than ever do not have time to wait. Be it in Iraq or Syria or elsewhere, future historians may say that it was yet another case of too little, too late. Whatever challenges the future holds, Aid to the Church in Need remains committed to helping Christians not only to survive persecution, but also to give witness to their faith. Their testimony of hope against all the odds is the greatest source of inspiration for all those dedicated to helping them.
Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to our program Where God Weeps, and we're here with John Pontifex, one of the authors of the report considering the persecution of Christians around the world. John, thank you for being with us here today in our program.
Very good to be able to join you today, Mark.
John, the report is titled A Snapshot of Christian Persecution Around the World Over the Last 2 Years, in which it focuses on 12 countries. Why a snapshot, and why only 12 countries?
The reason for that is that there has been a large output of reportage on the subject of persecution of Christians over the last 12 to 18 months. And we note that the situation has changed, but it has changed in a very particular way in those 12 countries that we have focused on. And we sensed that there was the need just to really close in our focus on just a few core countries in order to sense the degree to which things have changed, and in other places where things have remained rather more stable.
Now, before we get to some of those top offenders, which I want to get to in more detail, we'll take one step back. Who are those actors that are causing this Christian persecution?
Well, loosely they can be grouped into two sections. One is non-state actors. These are social groups that have no authority in government but do have authority in terms of societal influence.
For example, give us some ideas.
For example, we have Hindutva militant extremists in India, and you have Buddhist militant groups for example, in Sri Lanka. And these groups have a societal influence, but they can claim no authority in terms of the government. So that's one group. And then on the other hand, you have authoritarian states.
So these are the states themselves. These are state actors.
Absolutely. Those would be countries like China, where we have seen just recently with the introduction of new regulations on religious practice, a renewed crackdown on those religious groups that are not operating under the authority of the state. And there's this great sense in which religion can be seen or can act out in a way that is contrary to the state's objectives for the people, and can perhaps become a focal point of disunity and indeed rebellion in their eyes.
So in fact it's a power struggle, it's a concern about, as you say, who has the final word within a given state.
Absolutely. And in a state like China, or indeed Burma, Myanmar, and we can think of Eritrea too, there is this great sense in which, in order for the state to exert its authority, it must control all organs of influence, which necessarily involves the church. And when you have a situation in which the church has a great deal of influence from abroad, like the Catholic Church, with an authority based in Rome, that is inevitably going to be a cause for concern.
Now, John, there's the last group, which of course we've mentioned in the introduction and we've seen in the film, and that is fundamentalist Islam. This is, as we know, a non-state actor, but it has almost an area unto itself. Can you tell us a little bit about the role of fundamentalist Islam and the impact that we're seeing of this actor in the world today?
Yes, and you're right, Mark, to identify it as discrete in and of itself, because although, of course, Islamist extremism is in fact a form of non-state actor, in real terms, the rise of the what you might call a pandemic of militant Islam is something that's cross-continental, it's cross-societal, and it's really its tentacles of organisation are such that it can evade in a certain way the authority structure of any one government or any one region. So this means that we can see the same sort of influences of militant Islam at work in very disparate environments, be they the Philippines and Jolo, where we had the attack in January of 2019, in which 20 were killed.
In a bomb in a church.
In a bomb in a church,
yes.
That's right, in Our Lady Mount Carmel Cathedral in Jolo. And the same sort of militant extremism, if not the same culprits, the same brand, if you like, of Islam, is at work in Sri Lanka with the Easter Day bombings of 2019, in which 260 were killed and more than 500 were injured. So though they play out in different scenarios, they themselves as a phenomenon of persecution are one and the same.
John, I would like to take a little bit of a deep dive now into, and I think perhaps it's good if we stay with these examples of these different kinds of actors. So perhaps if we look at a state actor, what would be a country where we could isolate and say, now, this is perhaps China or an example like China, to deep dive into China, let's say, and there's a state actor. What kind of persecution are we seeing in particular and on whom?
Well, if I may, I might take the example of North Korea because it's particularly strident. With China, we have different communities and they have different pressures placed upon them. You have the official church, which is more recognised than the underground church, so it's more difficult to, in a way, categorise. But in North Korea, pretty well every individual Christian group suffers. We know in our report that 70,000 or more Christians are imprisoned or in some way under house arrest. And for example, we've heard reports of Christians being trampled down and even their churches and homes bulldozed. And the mere articulation of the Christian faith lands up with somebody being tortured for so doing. And we've sensed in our report that since Kim Jong-un came to power in 2011, following the death of his father, that in actual fact the situation has massively worsened. And this is one of the difficulties we face with Persecuted and Forgotten as a report, is that sadly the very worst offenders are often those which are very most difficult to reach. And yet we have to compensate for the lack of information by giving an indication nonetheless of the severity, even though there isn't necessarily evidence to create a full picture of how serious the situation is. What fragments we have are very concerning. And that's why I thought I'd draw out North Korea in that example.
John, and now to a non-state actor. We've talked about North Korea. What about an example of a non-state actor, for example, Nigeria?
Yes, I think, Mark, that's an extremely good example because Nigeria, we've seen the evolution of two discrete elements of non-state actors. We still have Boko Haram, the jihadi militant group, who are infamous for the kidnapping of the Chibok girls in northern Nigeria. And they have done wanton destruction of Christian communities all over northeast Nigeria. And they have very much allied themselves with Daesh, ISIS. And their name means Western education is forbidden. And they are absolutely upfront about wanting to really exterminate, and that is the right word to use, the presence of Christians in that region. But we also have a much more difficult to define non-state actor of the same type, but operating in a very different way. And that is, of course, the militant Fulani. And the report examines the degree to which, in the public discourse, there's been a failure to recognise the degree to which religious animosity plays such a significant part in the work, if you can call it that, of militant extremists from the Fulani group who have decimated Christian communities in part. And the report highlights the attack in Mbolom, the church there, in which more than 20 people were massacred at a very early morning mass, in which 2 priests were killed. And that case study is there to demonstrate that, yes, it may be that the militant Fulani seek new pastures in which to place their cattle. It may be there are pressures to do with ethnicity, but there's also religion. And religion here is playing a very fundamental part, because in that whole region, among the Islamist militant community, be they Boko Haram or militant Fulani, there is a drive to really push out all presence of the Christian groups.
I suppose, John, the one that has impacted the world with regard to Islamic fundamentalism is Syria. Can you give us a little bit now, a deep dive into the situation today in Syria, and what is the situation for Christians now? Where are they going? Are they leaving? Are they coming back? Tell us a little bit about Syria.
Well, I draw also, with respect of Syria, on the various trips that I've made to the country, and we have project partners and other communities there that we're working closely with. And we've seen the situation change in quite a remarkable way over the last 2 to 3 years. When I went in February of 2019, the main focus was really about how persecution had given way to the rise of extreme poverty. And what we're seeing in that region is communities that were decimated and forced out as a result of persecution are now very susceptible to the poverty that has come with the sanctions and with the loss of massive infrastructure. So if they had not been persecuted in this way, they would be better able to survive and prosper in these difficult times. So that situation means that we have Christian communities that are really struggling, and that has led to the continuation of exodus. We calculate that there are at least 2/3 less Christians now than at the start of the war in 2011. So there might be 500,000, there might be less in terms of the number of Christians in Syria. And we must always remember that it is Syria where the faithful were first called Christians. When Paul of Tarsus arrived, he arrived in a community which was already full of Christians in some parts. So the church in Syria is really important as being a touchstone for our faith as Christians. And to think that so many of these communities have been decimated and with very few Christians left is heartbreaking for that reason.
The cradle of our faith.
Absolutely. And now we see the new difficulties arising from the intervention by Turkey in northeast Syria, which has caused massive displacement of Christians and caused renewed fears of a rise of Daesh extremism, which the report warns about in terms of its impact on those communities that are remaining and the very possibility of them fleeing once more.
A renewed emigration.
Renewed emigration, which has once again come back into focus.
And I suppose what is perhaps less known is the importance of Christians in these societies, the plurality of the society.
That's absolutely right. In raising the flag for Christians who are persecuted, we by definition also raise the flag of other groups who have been persecuted. Often in some of these countries, we think of the Uyghur Muslims in China, their persecution actually has been worse than Christians. And for example, in the Iraq context, we think of the Yazidis. They, in a certain sense, suffered worse than the Christians. So what we're wanting to do with this report is to add our piece in the jigsaw that makes up a whole sense in which minority groups are threatened very widely, and how it's important for all of us, irrespective of our faith, to be able to stand up for the very value of plurality in all its forms. Because in the absence of plurality, only one thing can follow, and that is conflict, suspicion leading to conflict. And where does that get us?
John, we've spoken now about existing situations. What about the future? What is our prophetic voice? Where do you see perhaps the next, unfortunately, the next area of concern in the world in the topic of Christian persecution, and as indeed in the topic of religious freedom?
Well, an important case study that emerges in the report is that of Asia Bibi. Asia Bibi, the Christian woman who was accused of blasphemy and who had 10 years in jail, many of those years in death under threat of execution, finally achieved her freedom with her family in Canada, where she has been over these past months. That case was a watershed moment because it showed what can happen if the international community comes together to stand behind one particular family or context. And it gives us an opportunity to be able to raise the flag similarly with other situations. So we're hoping very much that we can build on that and do the same in other cases where we sense there's media interest that can be garnered. But that is often very much dependent on what's in the news, what's topical, what's in and what's out. We can't rely on that as a very definite way forward. What we can do, however, is draw on the massive progress that's been made within the international community to raise awareness of the plight of persecutions. We think of the US ministerial that we've had two now. The first one was in 2018, and we've had the second in 2019.
And the recent UN Day condemning religious-based violence on the 22nd of August, for example. That would be another example of the international community's interest in the topic.
And very important too, because nowhere better can we hope to gain consensus than around something that involves the United Nations. Thinking of the UK context, it was an extraordinary breakthrough to have had the then Foreign Secretary Jeremy Hunt commission an independent review into the persecution of Christians. And one of the great outputs of that great report was not least the many recommendations that were more than 20 in total, but also the fact that the way the report was put together meant that individual case studies of persecution had to be then assessed by the Foreign and Commonwealth Office in the UK, which had then to ask the question of themselves, what did we do to help these families or these communities or these individuals? And one of the great drives here in all these initiatives is to drive up religious literacy, because until now we've had a faith-blind approach whereby if it's a human rights matter concerning religion, the international community has not really wanted to know.
And that's my next question, John, is it too little too late? Is it the fact that, what have we not done? Where has the international community not been present? Where we see now we are reacting to the fact now that Christians are down from 1.3 in 2003 to less than 300,000 today in Syria, as you mentioned. Is it too little too late?
Unfortunately, only time will tell. We sense that we have, in some parts of the region of the Middle East, particularly Syria and Iraq, we have got a loss of viability in terms of the Christian community. What remains is such a small fragment that it can only wither if indeed there isn't direct help provided. And that's why the report really underlines the need for all governments to come together to recognise that Christians are a vital part of the mosaic of so many of the societies in which they are to be found, to the degree that they are recognised for the input that they provide in so many different fields, be it education, be it in healthcare, be it in other forms of welfare support. And it's absolutely incumbent on us to realise that if we don't act now, if there were to be another rise of Daesh extremism or something similar, it doesn't need to be very big for that individual act of persecution to essentially eliminate what remains of some of the oldest Christian communities in the world. And we can say that it's on our watch, it's in our time that this has happened. And that is the central message of this report.
The clock is ticking.
Yeah.
John, thank you very much for having been with us today in our program.
Thank you very much, Mark.
And thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for having been with us today in our program, Where God Weeps. If you'd like to know more about the situation of Christians, or perhaps even find a copy of the report, please look at the contact information at the end of this program. And we look forward to seeing you next week. Take care.